They said it was just a joke, the kind men tell when they don't want to admit they've crossed a line that can't be stepped back from. The saloon smelled of spilled whiskey and old wood, the kind of place where Boots dragged stories across the floor, and no one asked too many questions as long as the noise stayed loud enough. Ayanna stood near the center of it, still as a fence post in dry wind, her dark hair damp where the liquor had soaked through, catching the dim lantern light like something that refused to be dulled. Laughter moved around her in slow circles, not sharp, not loud, just enough to make it clear that no one intended to stop what had already been done. Harold Briggs leaned back against the bar like a man who owned more than the building, more than the land, more than the people inside it, rolling a glass between his fingers as if the moment belonged to him alone. "Ain't nothing personal," he muttered, though no one had asked, his voice carrying just enough for the room to hear, just enough to make it official. Ayanna didn't answer. She held something small in her hands, wrapped in a faded strip of cloth, her fingers curled tight around it like it weighed more than gold, like it mattered in a way none of them could understand. Boots shifted. A chair scraped. Somewhere in the back, a man coughed and then went quiet again. The sheriff stood near the wall, hat low, eyes fixed on a spot that wasn't her, wasn't Briggs, wasn't anything that would require him to choose a side. Outside, the wind pressed dust against the windows in soft, steady breaths, like the world itself was waiting to see which way this would turn. Briggs tipped his glass slightly, watching the last drops cling to the rim before falling to the floor. "You people come in here," he said, not looking at her. "Act like you belong." The words didn't land hard. They didn't need to. They settled into the room the way smoke does, slow and certain, filling every corner until there was nowhere left to breathe without tasting them. Ayanna's grip tightened around the cloth bundle, her knuckles pale against her skin, but her face remained calm, unreadable, the kind of calm that didn't ask for mercy and didn't offer anything in return. Someone chuckled, uncertain, then stopped when no one joined in. The piano in the corner sat silent, its keys untouched, as if even music knew better than to step into this moment. Ayanna lowered her gaze for just a second, not in submission, not in defeat, but as if she were listening to something deeper than the room, something older than the voices that tried to define her. Then she spoke, quiet, steady, in a language none of them claimed to know, the words soft but carrying a weight that didn't need translation, and for a brief second, the air shifted, subtle but real, like a storm turning miles away where no one could see it yet, but everyone would feel it soon enough. The words she spoke did not belong to the room, and that was the first thing that made the silence feel different, not heavier, but sharper, like something had shifted just out of sight. Ayanna lifted her head again, her eyes steady now, not on Briggs, not on the men who pretended not to watch, but somewhere beyond them, as if she were measuring something none of them could see. The cloth bundle in her hands moved slightly as her fingers adjusted their hold, careful, deliberate, like whatever rested inside could not be replaced if lost. Briggs let out a short breath through his nose, the kind of sound a man makes when he thinks he has already won. "Speak proper," he said, tapping the side of his glass against the bar, the dull sound echoing more than it should have. "This is not your land." A few heads nodded, slow and uncertain, as if agreement was easier than thought. The sheriff shifted his weight, boots creaking against the floorboards, but still he said nothing, his hand resting near his belt without purpose, without decision. Ayanna looked at Briggs then, really looked at him, not with anger, not with fear, but with something quieter, something that carried the weight of knowing. She spoke again, this time in English, her voice low but clear enough to reach every corner of the room. "I came for medicine." The words settled without force, without demand, yet they seemed to move through the space like a current, touching each man where he stood. Briggs tilted his head slightly, as if the answer amused him more than it should have. "And you got it," he said, glancing at the damp strands of her hair, then back at his glass. "A lesson is worth more than anything you came to buy." No one laughed this time. The quiet that followed did not belong to humor. It belonged to something else, something waiting. Ayanna did not react. She did not step back, did not step forward. She only tightened her hold on the bundle and drew in a slow breath, the kind that steadies a person before a long road. "The child is sick," she said, and for the first time, there was something beneath her calm, Not desperation, not fear, but urgency held in place by discipline. Briggs waved a hand as if brushing away dust. Then maybe you should have thought of that before walking in here like you own the place. The words landed, but they did not move her. If anything, they revealed more about him than they did about her. Near the far table, an older man shifted in his chair, his fingers tightening around his cup, his eyes flicking toward the door and then back again, as if weighing something he did not yet have the courage to act on. The lantern above the bar flickered, casting long shadows that stretched across the floor between them, turning distance into something visible. Ayanna lowered her gaze once more, not in submission, but in focus, and for a moment, the room felt smaller, as if everything inside it had been drawn toward the space between her and the man who thought he held power. Outside, the wind picked up, pressing harder now, carrying dust against the glass in steady waves. And somewhere beyond that door, unseen but approaching, something was already in motion, something that would not raise its voice, would not demand attention, but would change the weight of everything in that room the moment it crossed the threshold. The room did not move, but something inside it shifted, quiet and undeniable, like a line had been drawn where no one had noticed before. Ayanna stood on one side of it, alone but unbent, while the rest of them remained scattered across the other, close enough to see her, far enough to pretend they were not part of it. Briggs exhaled slowly, the confidence in him not loud, not aggressive, but settled, the kind that comes from years of never being questioned. He placed the empty glass down with care, as if the sound it made mattered more than the words he had already spoken. "You are still here," he said, not looking at her directly, but letting the sentence hang where it could reach her anyway. A man near the bar shifted his stance, rubbing the back of his neck, his eyes flicking between Briggs and the woman as if waiting for someone else to decide what this moment meant. Another man took a slow sip from his drink, though his hand trembled just enough to betray that he was paying attention. The sheriff cleared his throat, a small sound that carried no authority, no direction, just the echo of a role he was not stepping into. Ayanna did not move. The bundle in her hands rested against her chest now, held closer, protected, as if the space around her had grown less certain. "I will pay," she said quietly, and there was no hesitation in it, no bargaining, just a statement placed carefully into the silence. Briggs gave a faint smile, not warm, not kind, but satisfied in a way that made the room feel smaller. "It is not about money," he replied, his fingers brushing the edge of the bar, as if tracing something invisible. "It is about knowing where you stand." The words settled over the others, and one by one, their reactions revealed themselves in small ways, a glance turned away, a shoulder stiffening, a breath held too long. No one spoke against him. No one stepped forward. The space between action and inaction stretched thin, but it did not break. Ayanna lowered her eyes briefly, then lifted them again, and when she spoke this time, her voice carried a quiet steadiness that did not belong to someone asking permission. "I know where I stand." It was not a challenge. It was not defiance. It was something simpler, something more difficult to dismiss. For a moment, Briggs said nothing, and in that pause, the room seemed to lean in, as if even the walls were listening for what would come next. Outside, the wind shifted direction, pushing against the door now instead of the windows, the wood giving a soft, almost imperceptible creak. The older man at the table set his cup down with care, his fingers lingering on the rim longer than necessary, his gaze fixed on the floorboards as if they might offer him an answer he had not yet found. Ayanna adjusted her grip on the bundle again, and this time, the cloth slipped just enough to reveal a glimpse of what lay inside. Small glass vials, carefully sealed, the kind used for medicine that did not come easily and did not come cheap. The sight passed quickly, but it was enough. Enough for those watching to understand that she had not come here for pride, not for argument, but for something that mattered beyond this room. Briggs followed her movement with his eyes, and something in his expression shifted, not softened, but sharpened, as if he had just noticed the one thing that made this moment more than just a passing inconvenience. "Set it down," he said, his voice lower now, more controlled, carrying less noise but more weight. The words did not echo, but they lingered, pressing against the silence that had already grown too full. And still, no one spoke. Not the men at the tables, not the ones by the bar, Not the sheriff who stood close enough to act, but chose not to. The room held its breath, not because it was told to, but because it did not yet know how to move forward. And just beyond the door, the sound of something approaching drew closer, steady, unhurried, the kind of presence that did not need to announce itself to be felt. The words did not need to be repeated. They settled where they were spoken, firm and final, as if the room itself had decided to carry them forward. Ayanna did not move at first, and that stillness carried more weight than any step she could have taken. Her fingers remained wrapped around the cloth bundle, her grip steady, her breathing even, the kind of control that came from knowing that what mattered most could not be replaced once lost. Briggs watched her with a patience that was not kind, not generous, but practiced, the patience of a man who believed time always worked in his favor. "Set it down," he said again, quieter now, not louder, not sharper, but closer to something that expected obedience without needing to demand it. A chair shifted somewhere behind him, the sound small but clear, like a signal no one meant to send. The older man at the table lifted his eyes briefly, then lowered them again, his silence joining the others, adding to the weight that pressed against the center of the room. The sheriff shifted his stance, his hand brushing against his belt again, but still he did not step forward, did not speak, did not break the line that had already been drawn without him. Ayanna's gaze moved slowly across the room, not searching for help, not asking for it, but acknowledging each face as it chose its place in what was unfolding. There was no accusation in her eyes, no plea, only recognition. She understood exactly where she stood, and more importantly, she understood where they did not. The lantern above flickered again, casting shadows that stretched and pulled across the floorboards, turning every movement into something larger than it was. Outside, the wind pressed harder against the door, the wood creaking in a steady rhythm that matched something deeper, something approaching but not yet seen. Ayanna lowered her hands slightly, just enough for the cloth to shift again, revealing the small glass vials within, each one carefully sealed, each one holding something that could not be remade with ease or time. She looked at them for a brief moment, not with hesitation, but with clarity, as if weighing what they meant against what this moment demanded. Then she lifted her eyes back to Briggs, her voice quiet but certain. "This is not yours." It was not said with anger, not said with force, but it landed all the same, clean and direct, like truth spoken without decoration. Briggs smiled faintly, the kind of smile that did not reach his eyes. "Everything in this room is mine," he replied, his fingers tapping lightly against the bar, a slow, measured rhythm that carried confidence more than threat. The men around him did not challenge it. They shifted, they watched, they waited, but they did not step across the space that separated them from the moment. Ayanna held his gaze for a second longer, then looked down once more at the bundle in her hands, her fingers tightening just slightly, not in fear, but in decision. The air in the room seemed to hold itself, stretched thin between what had been said and what would come next. And then, without haste, without resistance, she bent her arms just enough to lower the bundle toward the edge of the bar, not placing it fully down, not releasing it, but bringing it close enough that the choice could be seen by everyone watching. The motion was slow, deliberate, the kind that made every eye follow it whether they wanted to or not. The sheriff took a small step forward, then stopped, as if something unseen had reached out and held him in place. Briggs leaned in slightly, his attention fixed now, not on her, but on what she carried, on what he believed he was about to claim. And just as the cloth brushed the wood of the bar, just as the moment balanced on the edge between taking and losing, the sound at the door changed, no longer wind alone, but something heavier, something steady, something that did not belong to the storm outside, but carried its own quiet weight as it came to a stop on the other side. The sound at the door did not crash or demand attention. It simply arrived, steady and certain, like something that had no need to prove it belonged. The wood shifted inward with a slow, deliberate motion, and a line of pale light cut across the floor, stretching through dust and boots and the stillness that had gathered inside. No one spoke. No one moved. Even Briggs paused, his hand hovering just above the edge of the bar where the cloth bundle rested, as if the moment had slipped slightly out of his control and he was deciding whether to reach for it or wait. The figure in the doorway did not rush. He stood there for a breath, letting the room settle around him, letting the weight of his presence arrive before he did. Ethan Cole stepped inside without a word, the brim of his hat casting a shadow that kept his eyes hidden at first. His boots carrying the dust of miles traveled across hard ground in long silence. The door eased shut behind him, the wind cut off, leaving only the quiet inside, thicker now, more aware. He did not look at Briggs. Not yet. His gaze moved once across the room, slow, measured, taking in the men who stood where they stood, the sheriff who remained near the wall, the older man who had not lifted his cup again, and finally, Ayanna. He stopped there, just for a moment, not long enough to draw attention, but long enough to see what mattered. The damp strands of her hair, the cloth bundle, the stillness in her posture that had not broken despite everything placed against it. Then he moved, not toward the bar immediately, not toward anyone, but into the space between, as if the room itself had opened just enough to let him pass. His boots sounded against the floor, not loud, not heavy, but each step carried its own quiet authority, the kind that did not ask permission. Briggs straightened slightly, his fingers curling back from the bundle as his attention shifted, not fully, but enough to acknowledge that something had changed. "We are in the middle of something," he said, his voice even, controlled, though it no longer filled the room the way it had before. Ethan did not answer. He reached the bar, stopping a few feet away, close enough to see, far enough to choose his place. For a second, nothing happened. The lantern flickered again. Someone near the back shifted their weight. The sheriff glanced up, then quickly away. And then Ethan lifted his head just enough for the shadow to fall back from his eyes, revealing a gaze that did not challenge, did not threaten, but did not yield either. He looked at the bundle first, at the small glass vials visible beneath the cloth, then at Ayanna, and finally at Briggs. "You done?" he asked, his voice low, steady, carrying no edge, no anger, just a question placed carefully into the center of everything that had been building. It did not echo. It did not need to. The room held it the way dry ground holds the first drop of rain, absorbing it, feeling its weight, knowing more would follow even if none came. Briggs let out a short breath, not quite a laugh, not quite dismissal, but something in between that did not land as firmly as he intended. No one joined him. No one moved. And in that quiet, the balance shifted, not loudly, not suddenly, but enough that everyone in the room could feel it, even if they could not yet name it. Briggs did not answer right away, and that hesitation was small, almost invisible, but it settled into the room like dust that refused to rise again. His eyes stayed on Ethan now, measuring, recalculating, searching, for something that would place this man where he believed he belonged. "I am not finished," he said at last, his voice steady, though the certainty beneath it no longer carried as far. Ethan did not move closer. He did not reach for the bundle, did not touch the bar, did not step into the space that would turn this into something louder than it needed to be. He only stood there, his weight even, his hands resting at his sides, as if the outcome did not depend on force, but on something else entirely. "Then finish," Ethan replied, just as quiet, just as measured, the words offering nothing, taking nothing, leaving the choice exactly where it had always been. The room held that exchange carefully, as if afraid to disturb it, as if any sudden motion might break something that could not be put back together. Briggs glanced down at the bundle again, the cloth slightly parted, the small glass vials catching the lantern light in faint reflections. For a moment, his hand hovered above them, close enough to claim, close enough to decide. Then he looked back at Ayanna, his expression tightening, not in anger, but in resistance, as if the presence of another witness had complicated something that had once been simple. "You heard me," he said to her, though his voice no longer carried the same ease. "Set it down and walk away." Ayanna did not move. Her gaze shifted once to Ethan, not in search of instruction, not in request, but in acknowledgement, a brief recognition that did not bind her to him, did not place her under his protection, but marked that she understood he had seen her clearly. Then she looked back at Briggs, her voice calm, unbroken. "It was never yours." The words landed again, the same as before, but this time they did not fade as easily. The older man at the table lifted his head, his eyes lingering longer now, as if something inside him had begun to shift, slowly, reluctantly. The sheriff straightened, just slightly, his hand no longer resting without purpose, but still not yet choosing action. Briggs exhaled through his nose, a faint smile returning, though thinner now, less certain. "You think this changes anything?" he said, his attention flicking toward Ethan for a fraction of a second before returning to her. A man walks in and suddenly the rules are different. Ethan's gaze did not waver. He did not respond to the challenge, did not rise to it, did not accept it as one. Instead, he spoke again, not to Briggs alone, but to the space between them, to the room that had chosen silence for too long. "Rules been the same," he said, his voice steady, carrying just enough to reach the edges without pressing against them. "People just forget who they apply to." The words did not strike like a blow. They settled, quiet and deliberate, finding their place in each man who heard them. No one laughed. No one dismissed them. The lantern flickered once more, and in that brief shift of light, the room seemed to reveal itself more clearly, the lines between each person no longer blurred, no longer easy to ignore. Briggs' hand lowered slightly, no longer hovering over the bundle, no longer certain of its claim. The space between taking and leaving stretched again, thinner now, more fragile. And in that narrowing space, something began to give, not loudly, not completely, but enough that the balance no longer belonged to one man alone. The shift did not come with a sound, but it moved through the room all the same, quiet and undeniable, like a truth that had finally found its place where it could not be ignored. Briggs straightened his shoulders, not in confidence, but in resistance, as if holding on to something that had already begun to slip. His eyes moved from Ethan to the men around him, searching, expecting the same silent agreement that had always followed him without question. But this time, the room did not answer the same way. The man near the bar lowered his gaze, no longer meeting Briggs' expectation. The older man at the table leaned back slightly, his hands resting flat now, no longer gripping his cup as if it were the only thing keeping him anchored. Even the sheriff, who had stood so carefully outside the moment, shifted forward just enough to be seen, his posture no longer entirely neutral. It was not defiance. Not yet. But it was no longer absence either. Briggs noticed. Of course he did. His jaw tightened, just slightly, the faintest sign that something had changed beyond his control. "You all standing there like this is something new," he said, his voice carrying a thin edge now, not sharp, but stretched. Nothing changed. No one answered. And that silence was different from before. It was no longer empty. It was full of something unspoken, something shared, something that did not belong to him. Ethan remained where he stood, his presence unchanged, his expression unreadable, as if he had not come to take anything, only to stand where something could finally be seen clearly. He did not look at the others. He did not need to. Whatever had shifted in them had not come from him alone. Ayanna drew a slow breath, her fingers still wrapped around the bundle, but her grip had softened, not from weakness, but from certainty. She was no longer holding it against the room. She was holding it for what it was meant to do. Her gaze moved once more across the faces around her, and this time, something in the room answered back, not with words, not with action, but with the quiet absence of ridicule, the quiet absence of dismissal. It was small, but it was enough. Briggs let out a short breath, something between frustration and disbelief, and for the first time, he did not reach for the bundle. His hand remained at his side, fingers flexing once before going still. "You think this ends different," he said, though the certainty was no longer there, only habit. Ethan's voice came again, just as calm, just as steady. It already did. The words did not rise. They settled, and in that settling, the room seemed to exhale, slowly, carefully, as if releasing something it had been holding for far too long. The lantern light steadied. The shadows stopped shifting. The line that had divided the room no longer held the same weight. Ayanna lifted the bundle fully now, bringing it back to her chest, not hurried, not cautious, just certain. No one stopped her. Not Briggs. Not the sheriff. Not the men who had stood and watched. The space she occupied opened, not because it was given, but because it could no longer be taken from her. And as she turned slightly toward the door, the sound of her movement carried more clearly than anything that had been said, not loud, not forceful, but final in a way that no argument could undo. The door did not open all the way, not yet, but the light that pressed through. Its edges seemed brighter now, clearer, as if the world outside had been waiting for this moment to finish before it moved again. Ayanna took one step toward it, then another, her boots quiet against the wood, each movement steady, unhurried, as if she had already left the room long before her body followed. No one blocked her path. No one spoke her name. The men who had filled the space with noise only minutes before now stood aside without being asked, their silence no longer empty, but shaped by something they did not quite understand. The sheriff shifted again, this time stepping fully away from the wall, his eyes lifting to follow her as she passed, his mouth opening slightly as if words might come, then closing again when none did. It was not fear that held him. It was the weight of knowing he had seen what was right and had chosen not to act until it was too late to claim it as his own. Briggs remained at the bar, his posture unchanged at first glance, but the stillness in him had hardened, not into strength, but into something brittle, something that could no longer bend without breaking. His gaze followed Ayanna as she moved toward the door, not with control, not with authority, but with the quiet recognition that whatever power he had claimed in this room had not survived the moment intact. He let out a breath, slow and measured, as if trying to steady something inside himself that had slipped beyond reach. "You walk out like that?" he said, though his voice did not rise, did not carry the same command it once had. "You think that makes you right?" Ayanna did not stop. She did not turn. Her steps continued, even, certain, the bundle held close against her chest, protected not by force, but by the simple fact that no one now reached to take it. The words fell behind her, unanswered, and in that absence, they lost whatever strength they had hoped to carry. Ethan remained where he stood for a moment longer, his gaze not following her, not watching her leave, but resting instead on the space she had occupied, as if marking it, as if acknowledging what had happened there without needing to speak it aloud. Then he moved, just once, stepping forward enough to close the distance between himself and the bar, his hand reaching into his coat with a slow, deliberate motion. He placed a few bills down on the worn wood, more than what had been lost, more than what had been taken, the edges of the paper catching the lantern light in a way that drew every eye without demanding it. "For the mess," he said quietly, not looking at Briggs, not offering the words to him alone, but to the room itself, to everything that had been allowed and everything that had now changed. No one answered. No one reached for the money right away. The act did not erase what had happened. It did not pretend to. It simply placed something back where something had been taken, not as repayment, but as recognition. Ethan's hand lingered on the bar for a brief second, then lifted away, leaving the bills behind like a marker no one could ignore. He turned then, not in a hurry, not with purpose that needed to be declared, and began to walk toward the door, his steps quiet, measured, the same as when he had entered. As he passed the sheriff, their eyes met for a brief moment, long enough for something unspoken to pass between them, not accusation, not forgiveness, but understanding. The sheriff looked down first, and by the time Ethan reached the door, Ayanna was already outside, the light around her clearer now, the dust settling in her wake, and the room behind them left holding a silence that would not be broken the same way again. Outside, the air felt different, not because the wind had stopped, but because it no longer pressed against anything that needed to resist it. Ayanna stepped down from the wooden porch, the dust beneath her boots rising softly, then settling just as quickly, as if even the ground recognized that nothing more needed to be disturbed. The bundle remained secure in her hands, held close but no longer guarded with the same tension, her fingers relaxed now, her shoulders steady, her breathing even. She did not look back at the saloon. She did not need to. Whatever had happened inside no longer followed her. It remained behind, held by those who had witnessed it, carried in a silence that would stay with them longer than any words could. Ethan stepped out a moment later, the door closing behind him with a quiet finality, the sound blending into the open space of the street where the world continued without pause. For a brief second, he stood there, not beside her, not in front of her, but simply present, his gaze moving across the empty stretch of road, the distant buildings, the horizon that did not belong to anyone but those who chose to walk it with respect. Ayanna turned slightly then, not fully, just enough for her eyes to meet his. There was no gratitude spoken, no debt acknowledged, no exchange that needed to be made. What passed between them was simpler than that, a recognition that required no language, no agreement, only understanding. Ethan gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, then shifted his weight as if preparing to move on, as if his part in the moment had never been about staying. Ayanna held his gaze for a second longer, then returned it to the road ahead, her steps beginning again, measured, certain, carrying her away from the town without hesitation. The distance between them grew naturally, without effort, without intention, each moving in a direction that did not need to cross again to remain meaningful. Behind them, inside the saloon, the silence lingered long after the door had closed. The men who had stood and watched now found no words that fit easily into what they had seen. The older man remained seated, his hands resting on the table, his eyes fixed on the place where Ayanna had stood, as if trying to understand how something so quiet had carried so much weight. The sheriff remained near the wall, though no longer leaning against it, his posture straighter now, his gaze thoughtful, as if the line he had avoided crossing before had been redrawn somewhere deeper, somewhere he could not ignore next time. Briggs stood at the bar, the money still lying untouched where it had been placed, his reflection faint in the glass behind it. He did not reach for it. He did not move it. He only stood there, the certainty that had once defined him now replaced by something less certain, something that did not announce itself, but remained all the same. Outside, the dust settled fully, the wind easing into a steady rhythm that carried the scent of dry earth and distance. Ayanna continued down the road, the bundle in her hands steady, purposeful, each step taking her closer to what mattered beyond the reach of the town she had left behind. Ethan walked in the opposite direction, his pace unhurried, his presence already fading into the wide openness of the land. Neither looked back, and in the quiet that followed, the town remained, not changed in its buildings or its streets, but altered in something less visible, something that would surface the next time a moment like that began to take shape, when silence would no longer feel as easy, and standing still would no longer feel the same. Out here, justice did not need to speak loudly to be heard. It only needed someone willing to stand where it belonged, and leave before anyone could mistake it for anything else.